Hi and welcome back to Heimler's History. Now we've been going through Unit 7 of AP World History. In the last video we talked about how World War I was carried on. Now that war ended in 1918, and not to spoil stuff or anything, but another world war is going to erupt in 1939. But in this video we're going to talk about economics during that interwar period. Specifically, we're going to see how worldwide economies were struggling during this period and how governments stepped in to address those economic woes. So if you're ready to get your brain cows milked, you know I am. Let's get to it. So as I said, after World War I, many worldwide economies got on the struggle bus and headed right down to Depression Town. The countries that made up the Allied powers, while victorious in the war, lost huge amounts of their workforce, and they spent tremendous amounts of hooch on the war effort. And therefore, they were not in the best economic position. Now, the countries who made up the Central Powers in general fared even worse, and maybe the best example of this is Germany. Now, you may remember that as part of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was blamed for the entire war and made to pay reparations for all the damage that they caused, which ended up being somewhere in the neighborhood of billions of dollars, or marks, or whatever. It was a lot of money. Additionally, Germany paid for their part in the war on their credit card. And they assumed that by winning the war and annexing resource-rich lands, they were going to pay back their debt. But as it turned out, the winning part of that equation didn't work out so well. And that means Germany, in addition to paying reparations, was in debt up to their German nose hairs. And so in the face of such crushing expectations, the German government did what any rational government would do. They started printing more money. And when that happened, the value of the German mark plummeted precipitously, and that led them into a situation called hyperinflation. And let me just try to illustrate how bad it got. You know how like when you go to another country and you have to exchange your money for their money so then you could buy stuff in their country? For example, if I went to Europe right now, I'd have to exchange my US dollars for euros, and the exchange rate as of this recording is $1 to 0.91 euros. And that means one of my dollars would buy almost €1. Okay, so by November of 1923, if I went to Germany with this $1 in my hand to exchange it for German marks, I would have gotten back 4.2 trillion marks. Or let me give you another example. In 1922, a German could buy a loaf of bread for 160 marks. But by 1923, that same loaf of bread cost 200 million marks. Now, this hyperinflation situation didn't only affect Germany. Remember, they owed money in the form of reparations to powers like France and Britain. But when Germany couldn't pay them, they in turn struggled to repay their debts to the United States. Add to that, the Soviets weren't paying their war debts back either because they went ahead and had themselves a communist revolution, and the Bolshevik government decided that old war debts did not belong to the new government. And in further addition to all of this, colonial economies suffered too because they had come to depend on their parent economies. And so colonial governments in Africa and Asia and Latin America all got thrown into this giant economic turd stew. And as my grandpappy used to say, once there's a turd in the stew, ain't nobody gonna eat that. And then in 1929, the United States stock market crashed and plunged it into a Great Depression that affected every other country that I just mentioned. So all this to say, in this interwar period, we got some economic problems to deal with. So how do we fix it? Well, the solution that many of these nations came up with is to call up Big Daddy government and get him to step in and fix it. Now, here's where I introduce you to British economist John Maynard Keynes. If you'll recall, many European nations had transitioned into a more laissez-faire type economy in which there was very little government intervention in the affairs of the economy. Now, according to laissez-faire economics, the economy will always correct itself in the long run. Just give it enough time and the economy will fix itself. And you know what? That's true. However, John Maynard Keynes reached in his back pocket, got the sauce out and said, you know what, in the long run, we're all dead. And what he meant was this: yes, the economy will correct itself in the long run, but while that's happening, the people who live in that economy are suffering terribly. So Keynes argued that we shouldn't wait for the economy to correct itself. Instead, the government should get involved and try to stimulate the economy back into health. And how would the government do such a thing? Well, by spending money. But wait, isn't the whole point that these depressed governments don't have any money? How are they going to spend money if they don't have any money? And the answer is, borrow it. And this is called deficit spending. We can illustrate this with an old-timey metaphor, priming the pump. Now, back in the day before you could just go turn on the sink and get water out of it, people had to get water out of wells. In order to get that water, there was a pump, and if you just started cranking the pump while it was dry, you wouldn't get anything out. So you had to put a little water in the top of the pump to prime the pump in order to get the water flowing. So that was Keynes's idea. Prime the pump of a depressed economy with deficit spending, and that's how you get the water, which is to say the money, to come out. Now, over in the United States, American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a huge believer in this idea. And his flagship program to get the United States out of depression was called the New Deal. So the way the U.S. government stepped in to address their economic difficulties was by borrowing money and putting millions of people to work on government projects. Under the New Deal, people got jobs building dams and public buildings and roadways. Now, it's been a matter of long debate amidst historians whether or not FDR's New Deal actually helped the economy recover from the Depression, because once the U.S. got involved in World War II, that basically solved their economic problems. problem. And whether it was because of World War II or because of the New Deal or some of both, it's hard to say for sure. Okay, that was the United States, but we can also see government intervention in the economy over in Russia as well. During this time, the Bolshevik government presided over a starving population and an economy on the brink of collapse. And so in 1921, Vladimir Lenin introduced what he called the New Economic Plan. Essentially, it was a rollback of communist policies intended to spur the economy back to health by, among other things, reintroducing private trade into Russia. Now, Lenin died in 1924, and the New Economic Plan essentially died with him. But now I get to introduce you to our good buddy and ruthless authoritarian dictator, Joseph Stalin. Just like Lenin, Stalin also got the government heavily involved in economic affairs. And in order to do that, Stalin introduced a series of 5-year plans. Now, the goal of these was to further industrialize Russia so that they could catch up with their European counterparts. The first step was to collectivize agriculture, so the government confiscated private land and set agricultural quotas for the farmers to meet. And not surprisingly, this collectivization enraged the farmers whose land was seized, and it's easy to understand why. Much of the food they grew was taken and sent to feed people back in the urban centers, and so their reaction was to burn their crops and kill their livestock. So it probably won't be much of a surprise to you to hear that Stalin's series of 5-year plans was pretty much an utter failure. Millions of people starved to death under these plans. But to be fair, while all those people were starving to death, at least the industrialization part of the plan, it went pretty well. Now, over in Mexico, we have yet another example of Big Daddy government stepping in to correct the economy. So after the Mexican Revolution was over, one political party came to dominate Mexican politics, and they were called the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI. And under the guiding hand of the PRI, the Mexican economy improved greatly. For example, they nationalized Mexico's oil industry, which heretofore had been largely owned by foreign investors. Alright, we also need to talk about this theme over in countries like Italy and Germany and Brazil, but in order to do that, I need to introduce you to the rise of a new kind of government during this time, namely fascist governments. By definition, fascism is an authoritarian and nationalistic system of government and social organization. A chief characteristic of fascist governments is the glorification of military might and the necessity of armed struggle. Often fascist governments blame their problems on the ethnic minorities that lived within their borders, and economically speaking, fascist governments wielded a heavy hand in the economy. Okay, so Italy was the first proper fascist government in Europe during this time. And for that, we have Benito Mussolini to thank. Mussolini reorganized the Italian economy in terms of something called corporatism. This meant that each sector of the economy was like different organs of the same body, and each organ was free to organize itself in whatever way it wished, just so long as it served the purposes of the greater whole. Now that's how it worked in theory, but in reality, fascist Italy was a totalitarian state that essentially controlled every aspect of the Italian society. Now, Mussolini had a great admirer over in Germany by the name of Adolf Hitler. Hitler was the leader of the Nazi Party, which he fashioned after the fascist Italians. And once Hitler was in power, he addressed the severe economic depression in Germany in the following manner. He went ahead and canceled all German reparation payments. Additionally, he led the German government into massive deficit spending to build up the military and take on internal infrastructure projects. And we'll get back to them in another video. Okay, that's Italy and Germany. Let's go over to Brazil and see how this is working out over there. Over in Brazil, they had experienced a very slow transition from an agricultural economy into an industrial one. Now, in 1930, a coup installed Getulio Vargas as president. Now, the people supported the installation of Vargas because they thought he'd bring democratic principles to bear on Brazil, but instead, he went ahead and organized the Brazilian government in a similar fashion as Mussolini's Italian government. Now, under Vargas's leadership, it's true that industry grew rapidly, but he also consolidated power by removing individual freedoms from the people. For example, under what he called the New State Program, Vargas limited the freedom of the press and imprisoned his political opponents. Alright, that's what you need to know about Unit 7, Topic 4 of AP World History. Click right here to get my AP World History review packet, just in case you're needing help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam, and you would like to support this channel. If you want me to keep making videos for you, then subscribe and I will comply forthwithly. Heimler out.